December 7, 1941, the date that Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto would never forget, though not for the reasons the world remembered. While Pearl Harbor burned above the waves, he piloted the Imperial Japanese Navy submarine I-58 through the cold Pacific depths, listening to the rhythmic ping of what should have been empty ocean. The hydrophone operator, Lieutenant Toshio Tanaka, pressed his headset closer, his face draining of color as he detected something unprecedented. A pattern of mechanical clicks echoing through the water, too precise to be natural, too foreign to be friendly. The Japanese submarine force had entered the war with supreme confidence, boasting the most advanced underwater fleet in the Pacific. Their submarines were technological marvels, faster, diving deeper, and equipped with the devastating Type 95 torpedo that left no wake to betray its approach. Commander Hashimoto had personally overseen the training of his 43-man crew, drilling them until they could navigate blind through the treacherous currents between Japan and the American West Coast. They considered themselves the silent hunters of the deep, masters of a domain where sight meant nothing and sound meant everything. But this sound was different. Lieutenant Tanaka rewound the recording cylinder, playing the sequence again for his commander. The pattern repeated with mechanical regularity, a series of high-frequency pulses that seemed to probe the water like invisible fingers. Hashimoto had studied American naval capabilities extensively at the Imperial Naval Academy in Itajima, poring over intelligence reports that detailed every known Allied vessel and weapon system. Nothing in those reports mentioned anything like this. According to declassified documents from the Naval History and Heritage Command, the Japanese Navy had intercepted rumors of American acoustic research throughout 1941, but Imperial headquarters dismissed them as psychological warfare. The prevailing belief among Japanese naval strategists was that sonar technology remained primitive, useful perhaps for detecting icebergs, but incapable of tracking a submarine operated by a skilled crew maintaining proper depth and speed discipline. Commander Hashimoto ordered his submarine to periscope depth, breaking protocol to get a visual confirmation of the surface. Through the lens, he spotted them, small cylindrical objects bobbing in the waves, spaced at precise intervals forming a grid pattern that stretched toward the horizon. They resembled fishing buoys, but something about their uniform placement and the waterproof cables trailing beneath them suggested a far more sinister purpose. These were not markers for fishing nets. These were sentinels. The realization struck Hashimoto like a depth charge. The Americans had deployed some form of listening network across the Pacific approaches. Every submarine that passed through this invisible fence would announce its presence, betraying its course, speed, and possibly even its identity. The ocean, which had promised to be Japan's greatest strategic advantage, allowing their submarines to strike American supply lines and coastal cities with impunity, had suddenly become transparent. Lieutenant Tanaka looked up from his station, waiting for orders. The rest of the crew remained at their posts, unaware that they had just encountered the technology that would fundamentally alter submarine warfare. Commander Hashimoto made a decision that would ripple through the Imperial Navy. Instead of destroying the buoys or reporting them immediately, he would observe, document, and understand this new threat. He ordered the submarine to circle the area at maximum silent running depth, cataloging the buoys' positions and characteristics. What Commander Hashimoto could not have known was that he had just discovered the early deployment of what the United States Navy called the Sound Surveillance System, a network of underwater hydrophones that would eventually span entire ocean basins. The war for control of the Pacific had just shifted from a contest of ships and aircraft to a battle of physics and acoustics, and Japan's submarine advantage was evaporating with every passing moment. January 23, 1942. Marked the morning when Lieutenant Commander Tatsunosuke Arizumi, aboard submarine I-8, made a discovery that confirmed Commander Hashimoto's worst fears. Operating off the coast of California, hunting American merchant vessels carrying oil from the southern refineries to the northern shipyards, his hydrophone operator detected the same ominous clicking pattern. But this network was denser, more sophisticated, and appeared to be actively tracking his vessel's movement. Arizumi was one of the Imperial Navy's most aggressive commanders, having already sunk 2 freighters during his patrol. His submarine had surfaced under cover of darkness to recharge batteries when the deck watch spotted another line of buoys, these ones equipped with what appeared to be radio antennae extending above the waterline. The implications were terrifying. These devices were not merely recording submarine passages, but actively transmitting their locations to shore stations or patrol vessels. The Japanese submarine doctrine, developed over 2 decades of intensive training and refinement, relied entirely on stealth and surprise. Their submarines would approach enemy convoys undetected, fire their superior torpedoes from close range, and slip away before escorts could respond. The entire strategic framework assumed that once submerged beyond visual range, a submarine became effectively invisible. These American buoys shattered that assumption completely. Ariazumi compiled a detailed report for Imperial Navy headquarters in Tokyo, including sketches of the buoy designs, recordings of the acoustic patterns, and estimates of the network's density and coverage. He sent this via encrypted radio transmission, breaking communication silence despite the risk of direction finding by American listeners. The situation demanded that every submarine commander understand what they were facing. Tokyo's response arrived 3 days later, and it revealed a disturbing pattern of denial at the highest levels of Japanese naval command. Vice Admiral Teruhisa Komatsu, overseeing submarine operations, acknowledged the reports, but concluded that the American systems were likely experimental and limited in scope. He ordered submarine commanders to maintain their aggressive patrol schedules, suggesting they could simply avoid the buoy networks by operating in deeper waters or along different approach routes. This assessment proved catastrophically wrong. Throughout February and March of 1942, Japanese submarines operating off the American west coast encountered the buoy networks repeatedly, regardless of their chosen routes or depths. The hydrophone arrays appeared capable of detecting submarines at ranges exceeding 10 nautical miles, far beyond the capability of any shipborne sonar system then in service. Worse still, the submarines began noticing a disturbing correlation. Within hours of passing through a buoy network, American patrol aircraft would appear overhead, forcing the submarines to crash dive and remain submerged for extended periods. Submarine I-23, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Shibata Kanashi, reported being harassed by aircraft for 3 consecutive days after crossing a buoy line near San Francisco. The aircraft dropped no depth charges but clearly knew the submarine's approximate location, methodically quartering the area and forcing Kanashi to exhaust his battery reserves, maneuvering to evade detection. The psychological impact on Japanese submarine crews proved as devastating as any physical damage. Submariners had always accepted that their work involved danger, but they had relied on the ocean's vastness and opacity as protection. Now, every time their hydrophones detected that telltale clicking pattern, they knew they had been compromised. The stress of prolonged submersion while evading patrol aircraft, combined with the knowledge that the Americans could track their movements, began wearing down even the most experienced crews. Commander Hashimoto, now operating in the Central Pacific after his encounter with the buoy network in December, received Ariazumi's report via the submarine communication network. He recognized immediately that the Americans had not simply deployed a defensive system around their coastline, they were constructing an acoustic barrier across the entire Pacific. The implications for Japan's submarine warfare strategy were profound and deeply troubling. The Japanese submarine force had begun the war with 63 operational boats, considerably fewer than Germany's U-boat fleet, but operating across far greater distances. Their mission parameters included attacking American supply lines, conducting reconnaissance of enemy fleet movements, and potentially supporting amphibious operations across the Pacific island chains. Every one of these missions now faced fundamental compromise. A submarine that could be tracked was a submarine that could be ambushed, and the Americans were demonstrating increasing sophistication in converting acoustic detection into tactical interdiction. March 15, 1942, brought an unexpected visitor to the Imperial Navy Submarine School in Kure. Professor Hantaro Nagaoka, Japan's most distinguished physicist and a pioneer in acoustic research. Vice Admiral Komatsu had finally acknowledged that the buoy problem required scientific expertise beyond traditional naval analysis. Nagaoka listened to the hydrophone recordings collected from multiple submarines, studied the sketches and photographs of captured buoy components, and delivered a verdict that silenced the assembled submarine commanders. "Gentlemen," Nagaoka began, his voice carrying the weight of unwelcome truth, The Americans have weaponized physics itself. What you are encountering is a passive acoustic array of unprecedented scale and sensitivity. These buoys do not emit signals that you might detect and avoid. Instead, they listen for the sounds that every submarine inevitably produces: propeller cavitation, machinery vibration, water displacement. The ocean, which you believed concealed you, has become their ally. The professor explained that sound traveled through water far more efficiently than through air, propagating for hundreds of miles under proper conditions. The Americans had discovered or perfected methods to filter out biological and environmental noise: whale songs, shrimp clicks, wave action, isolating the distinctive acoustic signature of mechanical vessels. Even at slow speed with electric motors, submarines produced characteristic sounds that differentiated them from natural phenomena or surface ships. Lieutenant Commander Arizumi, seated in the front row of the lecture hall, raised the question that haunted every submariner present. Can we defeat this system? Can we make our submarines truly silent? Nagaoka's response offered little comfort. Silence is a relative concept in physics. You can reduce your acoustic signature through careful design and operation, but you cannot eliminate it entirely. A submarine moving through water must displace that water. Propellers, regardless of their design, create pressure differentials. Machinery, no matter how well mounted, transmits vibrations through the hull. The Americans need not hear you clearly. They need only detect an anomaly in the ocean's natural acoustic background. The implications extended beyond mere detection. Nagaoka explained that an array of hydrophones, properly spaced and networked, could triangulate a submarine's position with considerable accuracy. The Americans had apparently deployed their buoys in geometric patterns, specifically designed for triangulation, with shore stations or ships equipped with calculating machines to process the acoustic data and generate firing solutions for patrol vessels and aircraft. Commander Hashimoto asked about countermeasures. Could submarines deploy noisemakers to confuse the arrays? Could they operate at depths or speeds that minimize their acoustic signature? Could they identify gaps in the buoy networks and exploit them? The professor acknowledged these tactical possibilities, but warned that they offered only temporary relief. The fundamental problem remained. The Americans had transformed the Pacific from an opaque medium that concealed submarines into a transparent one that revealed them. The technological advantage Japan's submarine force had enjoyed at the war's beginning, superior torpedoes, longer range, better trained crews, meant nothing if they could not approach targets undetected. Documents from the post-war interrogation of Japanese naval officers, preserved in the archives of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, reveal that this meeting in Curie marked a turning point in Japanese submarine strategy. The aggressive patrol doctrines that had characterized the war's opening months gave way to increasingly cautious operations. Submarine commanders began prioritizing survival over engagement, avoiding areas where buoy networks had been detected, and declining attack opportunities if they suspected American tracking. This defensive mindset created a strategic paradox. Japan's submarine force had been constructed to interdict American supply lines and support Japan's defensive perimeter across the Pacific Islands. But if submarines could not operate effectively in areas covered by acoustic detection, then vast stretches of ocean became inaccessible. American transport vessels carrying troops, equipment, and supplies to advance bases in the South Pacific sailed, increasingly unmolested, while Japanese submarines haunted the periphery of the detection networks, reduced from hunters to the hunted. Professor Nagaoka concluded his briefing with a broader observation about the nature of technological warfare. Japan had committed enormous resources to perfecting the tactics and equipment of submarine warfare as it existed in 1941. The Americans, rather than competing directly in that established paradigm, had changed the rules entirely by solving the detection problem. Naval warfare had entered a new era where sensors mattered as much as weapons, where the electromagnetic and acoustic spectrums represented battlefields as important as the physical ocean surface. The submarine commanders filed out of the lecture hall understanding that their war had fundamentally changed, but lacking any clear path forward. The Imperial Navy's submarine force would continue operating throughout the Pacific campaign, but it would never regain the strategic initiative or psychological confidence it possessed in the war's opening weeks. May 9, 1942, witnessed submarine I-28, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Kishinami Mitsuru, attempting to penetrate the acoustic barrier protecting the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. Mitsuru was executing direct orders from Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself, who needed intelligence on American carrier movements following the recent Doolittle raid on Tokyo. The mission represented both a tactical necessity and a test of whether Japanese submarines could still operate in heavily defended waters, despite the acoustic detection networks. Mitsuru approached the Hawaiian Islands from the northwest, maintaining strict silent running protocols that had been refined following Professor Nagaoka's briefing. His crew wrapped machinery in sound-dampening materials, operated at minimal speed using only the electric motors, and maintained precise depth control to avoid creating turbulence detectable from above. For 3 days, I-28 crept toward Pearl Harbor's outer defensive perimeter, encountering nothing but the ocean's natural sounds through the hydrophones. Then, at precisely 0430 hours on the mission's 4th day, Lieutenant Sakai Ishikawa at the hydrophone station detected the familiar clicking pattern. But these were not the passive buoys Mitsuru had encountered off California. These devices emitted active sonar pulses, sharp pings that struck I-28's hull and echoed back to the receivers, providing not merely detection, but precise range and bearing information. Mitsuru immediately ordered a crash dive to maximum depth, pushing his submarine beyond its recommended operating parameters. The pressure hull groaned under the strain as I-28 descended past 600 feet, approaching depths where a single compromised seal or weakened plate could lead to catastrophic implosion. The crew worked in absolute silence, every man aware that the slightest unnecessary noise might betray their position more clearly than the sonar pulses already painting their hull. The active sonar continued probing for 27 minutes, the pings arriving at regular intervals that suggested automatic operation rather than human control. Mitsuru studied the pattern, noting that the pulses seemed to originate from multiple fixed points, creating an interlocking detection grid that left no blind spots. This was not a mobile patrol vessel that might be evaded through careful maneuvering. This was a permanent installation, an acoustic fence that continuously scanned the approaches to Pearl Harbor. When the sonar pulses finally ceased, Mitsuru faced a strategic dilemma. He could attempt to penetrate the detection grid, accepting that his submarine would be tracked throughout its approach and withdrawal, or he could abort the mission, returning to Japan without the intelligence Admiral Yamamoto required. Neither option offered much appeal, but the decision was ultimately made for him when surface patrol vessels appeared on the hydrophones, their propeller signatures converging on I-28's last known position. The American response demonstrated sophisticated coordination between detection and interdiction forces. The patrol vessels, Mitsuru counted at least 4 distinct propeller patterns, spread out in a search pattern that suggested they possessed accurate information about his submarine's location. They did not waste effort searching random areas, but instead quartered a specific zone, gradually tightening their formation in a manner that would eventually force I-28 into a position where escape became impossible. Mitsuru ordered a course reversal, abandoning the mission and retreating at maximum safe speed. Even this maneuver proved complicated by the acoustic environment. Every increase in propeller rotation announced his presence more clearly. Every course change created additional noise as the submarine maneuvered through the water. The Americans had engineered a tactical situation where the submarine's only options were to remain motionless on the ocean floor until battery power expired, or to move and thereby reveal its location continuously. I-28 escaped the immediate pursuit by exploiting a thermal layer that partially masked its acoustic signature. But Mitsuru understood that luck rather than skill had saved his vessel. He drafted a detailed report for Submarine Fleet Headquarters, describing the density and sophistication of Pearl Harbor's acoustic defenses. His conclusion was unambiguous. Penetrating American naval bases protected by active sonar networks was effectively impossible with current submarine capabilities and tactics. This assessment spread through the Japanese submarine force with devastating effect on morale. The submarines had been designed and their crews trained for aggressive operations against enemy naval facilities and shipping lanes. But if the primary targets were now protected by impenetrable acoustic barriers, what role remained for the submarine force? The Imperial Navy's strategic planning had assumed that submarines would sink enough American transport vessels to slow or halt their advance across the Pacific. Instead, Japanese submarines found themselves forced into increasingly peripheral operations, attacking isolated targets in poorly defended areas, while the main American supply lines operated unmolested. The American acoustic barrier had achieved something more significant than simply detecting and tracking submarines. It had created a psychological barrier that inhibited Japanese submarine commanders from attempting the aggressive operations their doctrine required. Every hydrophone contact, every sonar ping, served as a reminder that the ocean offered no sanctuary, that the Americans could locate and track any submarine operating within their defensive networks. July 21, 1942, found Commander Hashimoto's submarine I-58 conducting a solo patrol in the waters between the Solomon Islands and Australia, hunting for American supply convoys supporting the garrison at Guadalcanal. The patrol had lasted 43 days, during which Hashimoto's crew had sighted exactly 3 eligible targets, all heavily escorted by destroyers and patrol aircraft, all operating in areas where acoustic buoys betrayed I-58's position before any attack could be launched. The empty ocean phenomenon, as submarine commanders had begun calling it, reflected a fundamental shift in American convoy operations. Rather than dispersing merchant vessels across broad areas where submarines might intercept them through random search, the Americans had consolidated their transport operations into narrow corridors protected by overlapping acoustic detection networks and aggressive aerial patrols. Japanese submarines encountered either heavily defended convoys they could not safely attack, or vast expanses of empty ocean where no targets existed. Hashimoto studied the reports from other submarine commanders, searching for patterns that might reveal vulnerabilities in the American system. Submarine I-19 had attempted to attack a convoy near the Coral Sea, only to be driven off by destroyers that appeared to know the submarine's exact position before the attack began. Submarine I-31 had successfully torpedoed a transport vessel south of Espiritu Santo, but the escort vessel's response had been so rapid and accurate that I-31 barely escaped, suffering severe depth charge damage that forced its return to Japan for repairs. The mathematics of submarine warfare had shifted decisively against Japan. In the war's early months, Japanese submarines had sunk American vessels at a rate that, if sustained, might have seriously disrupted Allied operations across the Pacific. But by mid-1942, the sinking rate had collapsed, while submarine losses to depth charge attacks and aircraft bombing had increased dramatically. The Imperial Navy was losing its submarine force through a combination of direct combat losses and operational attrition, submarines damaged by near-miss depth charges, forced to abort missions due to mechanical failures under stress, or suffering crew psychological problems from repeated evasion of detection networks. Hashimoto's hydrophone operator, Lieutenant Tanaka, had developed an almost supernatural ability to distinguish between natural ocean sounds and the acoustic signatures of American detection systems. He could identify the characteristic click of passive hydrophone buoys, the ping of active sonar installations, and even the subtle propeller harmonics of American patrol vessels operating at maximum listening range. This skill kept I-58 alive, but also served as a constant reminder of how thoroughly the Americans had filled the ocean with sensors. On the patrol's 47th day, Tanaka detected something unusual, an acoustic pattern that did not match any known American system. The sound was continuous rather than pulsed, resembling the hum of heavy machinery transmitted through the water. Hashimoto altered course to investigate, maintaining cautious silent running protocols while approaching the source of the anomaly. What they discovered redefined their understanding of the acoustic detection networks. Through the periscope, Hashimoto observed an American naval vessel unlike any he had encountered, a converted merchant ship bristling with antennae and cable handling equipment, actively deploying additional hydrophone buoys in a systematic grid pattern. The Americans were not merely maintaining their existing detection networks, they were actively expanding them, extending acoustic coverage across previously unmonitored ocean areas. The vessel worked with methodical efficiency, its crew deploying buoys at precisely measured intervals, while smaller patrol boats circled the perimeter, providing protection against exactly the sort of submarine observation that Hashimoto was conducting. He watched for 3 hours, documenting the operation in detailed notes and sketches. understanding that he was witnessing the physical manifestation of Japan's strategic nightmare. The Americans possessed the industrial capacity to manufacture these acoustic systems in quantities that Japan could not match or counter. Every week brought new buoy deployments, expanding the detection network across additional thousands of square miles of ocean. The Pacific, which had seemed vast enough to swallow entire fleets, was being systematically wired with sensors that transformed it from an opaque medium into something approaching transparency. Hashimoto faced a decision that epitomized the impossible choices confronting all Japanese submarine commanders. He could attack the buoy-laying vessel, potentially destroying one ship and temporarily disrupting the network's expansion. But doing so would require surfacing to use his deck gun or closing to torpedo range, either of which would announce his presence to every acoustic sensor in the area and likely result in I-58's destruction by the escorting patrol boats and inevitable aerial response. Or he could remain hidden, documenting the operation and reporting it to fleet headquarters, preserving his submarine and crew for future operations, but allowing the acoustic network to continue its inexorable expansion. The latter choice offered the only reasonable path to survival, but it also represented a tacit acknowledgement that Japanese submarines could no longer meaningfully contest American control of the Pacific's sea lanes. Hashimoto chose survival, withdrawing from the area without attacking. His report to Imperial Navy headquarters provided detailed intelligence about American buoy-laying operations, but offered no recommendations for countermeasures, because none existed within Japan's available resources and technology. The submarine force could continue operating in the shrinking spaces between detection networks, accepting diminishing returns and increasing losses, or it could withdraw to purely defensive operations around Japan's home islands. Neither option promised strategic success. September 3, 1942 witnessed an unusual gathering at the Imperial Naval Academy in Itajima, where the surviving submarine commanders assembled for what the official records described as a strategic reassessment conference, but what participants understood as a funeral for their service's operational independence. Vice Admiral Komatsu presided over the meeting, his face betraying the strain of defending increasingly indefensible operational directives from the Navy General Staff. 23 submarine commanders occupied the Academy's main conference hall, representing nearly 40% of Japan's remaining operational submarine force. The others were at sea, executing patrols that everyone in the room understood had become more symbolic than strategic. The assembled commanders represented the elite of Japan's underwater warfare capability, men who had trained for decades, who had pioneered long-range submarine operations, who had believed they would be decisive in the Pacific War. Admiral Komatsu opened the conference with statistics that confirmed what every commander already knew. Between Pearl Harbor and the present date, Japanese submarines had sunk 63 Allied merchant vessels and damaged another 41. These numbers represented less than 3% of the shipping tonnage the Americans had committed to Pacific operations. Meanwhile, Japan had lost 14 submarines to enemy action, representing more than 20% of the force that had entered the war 9 months earlier. The admiral then presented intercepted American naval communications, translated by Japanese intelligence officers, that revealed the true extent of the acoustic detection network. The Americans called it the Sound Ocean Surveillance System, a name that promised future expansion beyond even its current impressive scope. The network now covered all approaches to major American bases in Hawaii, the Aleutians, and the South Pacific. Additional systems were being deployed along the convoy routes between Australia and the forward bases at Guadalcanal and New Caledonia. Commander Hashimoto listened to these revelations with a sense of grim vindication. His December 1941 encounter with the first buoy networks had been dismissed as an anomaly, a localized defensive measure that could be circumvented through tactical adaptation. Now, 9 months later, the reality was undeniable. The Americans had solved the submarine detection problem comprehensively, and Japan possessed neither the technology nor the industrial capacity to counter it. Lieutenant Commander Ariazumi, who had been advocating for more aggressive submarine tactics despite the acoustic networks, finally acknowledged the mathematics of attrition. Even if we accept a 1-for-1 exchange rate, 1 submarine lost for each American vessel sunk, we cannot win this contest. The Americans build transport ships faster than we can sink them, and they build submarine detection systems faster than we can deploy submarines. We are fighting an industrial war with an artisanal force. The conference discussions revealed the extent to which acoustic detection had paralyzed Japanese submarine operations beyond mere tactical limitations. Submarine crews reported increasing psychological strain from operating under constant potential surveillance. Knowing that their movements might be tracked by invisible sensors produced a form of stress distinct from traditional combat anxiety. Sailors who had been trained to think of the ocean depths as a sanctuary now felt exposed, vulnerable, hunted. Medical officers reported increasing cases of acoustic sensitivity among hydrophone operators. Men like Lieutenant Tanaka, who had developed hypersensitivity to sounds in the water, who could no longer distinguish between genuine threats and the ocean's natural acoustic background. Some operators were experiencing auditory hallucinations, hearing detection systems that did not exist, or missing genuine threats because their overloaded perceptions could no longer reliably filter signal from noise. Admiral Komatsu then delivered the directive that formalized the submarine force's diminished role. Effective immediately, Japanese submarines would cease independent offensive patrols against American convoy routes. Instead, they would be reassigned to defensive operations, transporting supplies to isolated island garrisons, conducting reconnaissance for the surface fleet, and maintaining a submarine presence around Japan's home islands as a deterrent against possible American invasion. This directive represented the silent surrender of Japan's submarine warfare strategy. The submarines would continue operating, crews would continue going to sea, but they would no longer attempt to contest American control of the Pacific's maritime supply lines. The acoustic detection networks had achieved what depth charges and patrol aircraft alone could not. They had transformed the ocean from a medium where submarines could hide and strike into a transparent battlefield where every movement carried unacceptable risk. Commander Hashimoto spoke during the conference's closing session, articulating what others felt but had not yet expressed. We entered this war believing that our submarines would be a decisive weapon, capable of strangling American supply lines and supporting our defensive perimeter across the Pacific. We trained for decades to perfect silent running, deep diving, and long-range operations. But the Americans changed the nature of submarine warfare itself. They did not build better submarines or better depth charges. Instead, they made the ocean visible. And against visibility, stealth has no answer. The commanders departed at Tajima, understanding that their service branch had been effectively neutralized as a strategic force less than a year into a war that would clearly last much longer. The submarines they commanded still functioned perfectly. Their crews remained well-trained and motivated. Their torpedoes were still the most advanced in any navy. But none of these advantages mattered in an ocean where their movements were continuously monitored, where every approach to a target was observed, where surprise, the essential element of submarine warfare, had become impossible to achieve. November 18, 1942, brought Commander Hashimoto to the Naval Technical Research Institute in Tokyo, where he had been temporarily reassigned to assist in developing acoustic countermeasures. The facility occupied a sprawling complex of laboratories and testing facilities, staffed by Japan's most accomplished naval engineers and physicists. Their mission was to find some technological solution to the acoustic detection problem that had paralyzed the submarine force. Hashimoto spent his first week reviewing the research projects underway. One team was developing sound-absorbent hull coatings that might reduce a submarine's acoustic signature. Another group was experimenting with acoustic decoys, devices that could be deployed from submarines to simulate propeller sounds and lure American patrol vessels away from the actual submarine's location. A third team was attempting to design a passive listening system that could detect American hydrophone buoys before the submarine came within their effective range. The work was technically sophisticated, representing the best efforts of Japan's scientific establishment. But Hashimoto recognized immediately that these countermeasures addressed symptoms rather than the fundamental problem. The sound-absorbent coatings reduced acoustic signatures by perhaps 20%, meaningful in ideal conditions, but insufficient to make submarines invisible to the dense American detection networks. The acoustic decoys worked in testing tanks, but had minimal effect in the ocean's complex acoustic environment, where American shore stations could distinguish between genuine submarines and mechanical simulators. Professor Nagaoka, who had briefed the submarine commanders in March, now worked at the Research Institute, applying his expertise in acoustics to the military problem. He took Hashimoto aside one afternoon, walking the Institute's grounds while explaining the deeper challenges they faced. The Americans succeeded because they approached submarine detection as a problem in applied physics, rather than traditional naval warfare, Nagaoka explained. They mapped the ocean's acoustic properties, identifying how sound propagates under different conditions of temperature, salinity, and pressure. They developed hydrophones sensitive enough to detect propeller cavitation at ranges exceeding 10 miles. They built shore stations capable of processing acoustic data from hundreds of buoys simultaneously, using calculating machines to triangulate submarine positions with remarkable accuracy. Hashimoto asked the question that had haunted him since his first encounter with the buoy networks. Could Japan have developed similar systems if we had recognized the importance of acoustic detection before the war? Nagaoka's response was both technical and philosophical. Japan has excellent physicists and engineers. We could have, theoretically, developed acoustic detection technology comparable to what the Americans deployed. But doing so would have required different strategic priorities. The Americans invested enormous resources in solving the submarine detection problem because they recognized that their merchant fleet was vulnerable. They approached it as an existential threat, requiring a revolutionary solution. Japan's Navy, by contrast, focused on perfecting existing submarine technology, better torpedoes, longer range, superior tactics. We assumed that incremental improvements to proven systems would prove decisive. The professor's analysis illuminated a broader pattern in how nations approach technological warfare. Success came not merely from possessing superior technology, but from correctly identifying which technological problems mattered most and directing resources towards solving them comprehensively. The Americans had demonstrated this principle repeatedly, not just with acoustic detection, but with radar, aircraft carriers, and amphibious warfare doctrine. They identified strategic needs and then marshaled their industrial and scientific capacity to meet those needs, even when doing so required abandoning traditional approaches. Hashimoto spent 3 months at the Research Institute, contributing his operational experience to the countermeasure development efforts. But by February 1943, he concluded that the work, while scientifically interesting, could not restore Japanese submarines to strategic effectiveness. The Americans' lead in acoustic detection technology was simply too great, and their industrial capacity to deploy and expand their surveillance networks exceeded Japan's ability to counter them. The Institute's final report, submitted to the Navy General Staff in March 1943, acknowledged these realities with unusual candor for a military document. The report stated that meaningful countermeasures to the American acoustic detection networks would require technological breakthroughs and industrial investments that exceeded Japan's available resources, even if the war continued for many additional years. The recommendation was stark. The Imperial Navy should accept that its submarine force had been effectively neutralized as an offensive weapon, and should redeploy submarines to roles where acoustic detection posed less decisive disadvantage. This admission represented something rare in military history, a formal acknowledgement that an entire service branch had been defeated not through direct combat, but through technological obsolescence. The Japanese submarines remained functional, their crews remained capable, but the operational environment had changed in ways that rendered their core mission impossible to execute. Hashimoto returned to Submarine Command in April 1943, taking command of the newly commissioned I-58, a larger submarine than his previous vessel, equipped with the best technology Japan could produce, including experimental sound dampening systems developed at the Research Institute. But even with these improvements, his operational orders reflected the submarine force's diminished role. Transport missions to isolated garrisons, reconnaissance patrols far from American detection networks, and defensive positioning around Japan's home islands. The Pacific War would continue for another 2.5 years after Hashimoto's time at the Research Institute. Japanese submarines would occasionally achieve tactical successes, including Hashimoto's own sinking of the cruiser USS Indianapolis in July 1945. But these individual victories occurred against a backdrop of strategic irrelevance. The American acoustic detection networks had transformed the Pacific into an ocean where submarines could not effectively contest control of sea lanes or threaten supply lines. The lessons from Japan's submarine experience extended beyond the specific technology of acoustic detection. The war demonstrated that technological surprise, once achieved, could be decisive even against numerically inferior forces. But it also showed that technological advantage could be fleeting, vulnerable to revolutionary rather than evolutionary counter-innovations. Japan had achieved technological surprise at Pearl Harbor through their advanced naval aviation doctrine. America had countered with the acoustic detection networks that neutralized Japan's submarine advantage. The war became a contest of technological innovation as much as traditional military operations. August 15, 1945 arrived with Commander Hashimoto aboard submarine I-58, submerged off the coast of Japan, listening to Emperor Hirohito's radio broadcast announcing Japan's surrender. The war that had begun with such confidence in December 1941 had ended with Japan's submarine force reduced to a shadow of its former capability. Of the 63 submarines that had entered the war, only 38 survived to hear the Emperor's words. The rest lay scattered across the Pacific floor, victims of the acoustic detection networks and the patrol forces they guided to their targets. Hashimoto surfaced his submarine for the final time as a wartime commander. His crew assembled on deck in formal surrender posture as American patrol vessels approached. Through his binoculars, he could see the acoustic buoys dotting the water's surface, the same cylindrical sentinels that had haunted Japanese submarine operations throughout the war. They floated serenely, their hydrophones continuing to listen even though the war they had been deployed to fight had ended. The immediate post-war period brought American technical intelligence teams to examine Japanese submarine technology, searching for innovations they might have overlooked. They found submarines of impressive quality, well-constructed, long-ranged, armed with excellent torpedoes. But they also found no meaningful countermeasures to acoustic detection, no technological breakthroughs that had restored Japanese submarines to operational effectiveness. The examination confirmed what operational results had already demonstrated. The acoustic detection networks had so completely dominated the submarine warfare domain that Japan had effectively abandoned the effort to counter them. Post-war interrogations of Japanese submarine commanders and naval staff officers revealed the psychological and strategic impact of the acoustic detection networks. Captain Toshitake Ueno, who had served on the Navy General Staff, explained that the networks had forced a fundamental recalculation of submarine utility. We had planned for our submarines to sink enough American transport vessels to slow their advance across the Pacific by at least 6 months. Instead, within 6 months of the war's start, we had abandoned offensive submarine operations against American supply lines. The acoustic networks did not need to destroy our submarines. They merely needed to make submarine operations too costly and ineffective to pursue. The American development and deployment of the Sound Ocean Surveillance System remained classified long after the war's end, but its impact shaped naval warfare doctrine for decades. The principle it established, that oceans could be made transparent through passive acoustic monitoring, became foundational to Cold War submarine operations. The principle it established, that oceans could be made transparent through passive acoustic monitoring, became foundational to Cold War submarine operations. The United States Navy expanded the wartime networks into a permanent global surveillance system, deploying thousands of hydrophones across strategic ocean passages and continental shelves. The technology that had neutralized Japanese submarines in 1942 evolved into the Sound Surveillance System, SOSUS, which would track Soviet submarines throughout the Cold War decades. Commander Hashimoto spent his post-war years reflecting on the technological revolution he had witnessed firsthand. In interviews conducted during the 1960s and 70s, he spoke candidly about the moment he first encountered the American buoys in December 1941. I understood immediately that we were facing something unprecedented, he recalled. But I did not understand, none of us understood, how completely it would change submarine warfare. We thought it was a tactical problem requiring tactical solutions. We did not realize it was a strategic revolution that invalidated our entire operational doctrine. The documentary record preserved in the National Archives reveals that American acoustic detection development had begun years before Pearl Harbor. The Office of Naval Research had commissioned studies on underwater sound propagation as early as 1937, recognizing that submarine warfare posed the greatest threat to American merchant shipping in any future conflict. By 1940, prototype hydrophone arrays were undergoing testing off the California coast. The attack on Pearl Harbor accelerated deployment schedules but did not initiate the program. America had anticipated the submarine threat and invested in countermeasures before war began. This foresight contrasted sharply with Japanese naval planning. Intelligence reports captured after the war showed that Japanese naval intelligence had received fragmentary information about American acoustic research throughout 1940 and 1941. These reports were filed and noted but generated no significant response. Japan's submarine doctrine, developed over 20 years of refinement, seemed so thoroughly proven that alternative approaches to submarine warfare, either offensive or defensive, received minimal consideration. The strategic implications extended beyond the immediate tactical defeats Japanese submarines suffered. The acoustic networks forced Japan to commit resources to defending supply lines that should have been vulnerable to submarine interdiction. Instead of concentrating escort vessels and patrol aircraft around the home islands, Japan had to disperse these forces across vast ocean areas to protect merchant shipping from submarines that, in theory, should have been neutralized by American detection systems. This resource diversion contributed to Japan's inability to effectively counter American advances across the Pacific island chains. Professor Nagaoka, who survived the war and returned to academic physics, wrote extensively about the technological lessons from the acoustic detection networks. In a 1953 paper published in the Journal of Applied Physics, he argued that the American success demonstrated the importance of applying fundamental scientific principles to military problems rather than simply engineering incremental improvements to existing weapons. The Americans asked a different question than we asked, Nagaoka wrote. We asked how to make better submarines. They asked how to make the ocean transparent. The second question, though harder to answer, proved more strategically valuable. The human cost of the acoustic detection networks appeared in the statistics preserved in Japan's post-war naval records. Japanese submarine crews suffered casualty rates exceeding 70%, the highest of any service branch in any combatant nation during World War II. These casualties resulted partly from combat losses, but also from the cumulative stress of operating under constant potential surveillance. Submarine crews that survived multiple patrols through acoustic detection networks reported psychological effects that persisted for decades: hypervigilance, acoustic sensitivity, recurring anxiety about invisible observation. Lieutenant Tanaka, Hashimoto's hydrophone operator throughout much of the war, exemplified these long-term effects. He survived the conflict, but never fully recovered from the acoustic hypersensitivity he developed while monitoring for American detection systems. In peacetime, he reported being unable to tolerate background noise that others found unremarkable: the hum of machinery, the sound of rain on water, even ordinary conversation in crowded rooms. The ocean's sounds, which he had learned to parse with such precision during the war, had permanently altered how his brain processed auditory information. The technological legacy proved even more enduring than the human one. The basic principles of passive acoustic detection that the Americans pioneered during World War II remained classified for decades, but fundamentally shaped how navies approached submarine operations. Every submarine designed after 1945 incorporated sound-dampening technologies intended to defeat acoustic detection. Every navy that operated submarines invested in understanding ocean acoustics, mapping thermal layers and sound channels that might conceal their vessels from hydrophone arrays. The acoustic detection networks also influenced broader technological development beyond military applications. The signal processing techniques developed to distinguish submarine sounds from ocean background noise contributed to advances in sonar systems used for civilian purposes: ocean mapping, fisheries management, underwater archaeology. The calculating machines built to triangulate submarine positions from multiple hydrophone contacts represented early steps toward computer-based data analysis that would transform numerous fields in subsequent decades. Commander Hashimoto's final assessment of the acoustic detection networks came in a 1980 interview, conducted shortly before his death. The interviewer asked whether he believed Japan could have won the submarine warfare campaign if the acoustic networks had not been deployed. Hashimoto's response reflected both professional honesty and historical perspective. The acoustic networks accelerated our defeat in the submarine domain, but they did not cause it. America's industrial capacity would have eventually overwhelmed our submarine force through sheer numbers: more patrol vessels, more aircraft, more depth charges. What the acoustic networks did was make that industrial advantage immediately decisive. They transformed a contest Japan might have prolonged into one we lost definitively within the war's first year. This acknowledgement illuminated a broader truth about technological warfare. Revolutionary technologies did not necessarily change which side possessed fundamental advantages in industrial capacity, population, or resources, but they could dramatically accelerate how those underlying advantages manifested in military outcomes. The acoustic detection networks allowed America to leverage its industrial superiority immediately and decisively, rather than waiting for that superiority to gradually accumulate through production of conventional weapons and platforms. The Japanese submarine forces' experience also demonstrated the difficulty of recovering from technological surprise. Once the Americans had deployed their acoustic networks and Japanese submarines had been forced into defensive operations, no amount of tactical adaptation or incremental technological improvement could restore the strategic balance. The Americans maintained their lead in acoustic detection technology throughout the war, continuously improving their hydrophones' sensitivity, expanding their network's coverage, and refining their data processing capabilities. Japan never closed the gap, because closing it would have required not just matching American technology, but surpassing it, and doing so while simultaneously fighting a multi-theater war that consumed all available resources. The Pacific Ocean, which in December 1941 had seemed vast enough to conceal entire submarine fleets, had become by August 1945 an ocean where every mechanical sound echoed through invisible networks of hydrophones, where submarines operated with the knowledge that their movements might be continuously tracked, where the depths offered no sanctuary from surveillance. This transformation represented one of World War II's least publicly known but most strategically significant technological revolutions. A revolution that began with Commander Hashimoto's encounter with those mysterious buoys in the dark waters off Pearl Harbor and ended with the fundamental restructuring of how nations approached underwater warfare. The legacy endured in the Cold War's submarine operations, in the SOSUS arrays that monitored Soviet submarine movements for 4 decades, in the acoustic signature analysis that became central to anti-submarine warfare, in the silent running technologies that submariners still practice today. The ocean that Japan's submarine commanders believed would be their greatest ally had become, through American technological innovation and strategic foresight, their most persistent adversary. And in that transformation lay lessons about technology, strategy, and the unpredictable nature of warfare that resonated far beyond the specific circumstances of